With one of the most jam-packed years of new releases in recent memory, there are a lot of great games to talk about. Now, I could be boring and just give you a top 10 list, but instead, I would like to go over an assortment of different categories to give all sorts of games their shoutouts for different reasons. Essentially, this is my personal Game of the Year show to reflect on the year that was. There are several titles I haven't played due to not being interested, not having the time, or not wanting to fork up the cash. That would include Armored Core 6, Alan Wake 2, Pikmin 4, Diablo 4, Star Wars Jedi Survivor, Sea of Stars, and Assassin's Creed Mirage. I was able to sample without getting far enough to really know how I feel about the following titles: Baldur's Gate 3, Super Mario RPG, Dredge, and Lies of P. So with all those big caveats out of the way, this is going to be the games that stood out to me the most this year, even if maybe I didn't necessarily finish it depending on the category. So for example, I want to be able to consider a game I haven't finished as the best story of the year, but perhaps it could win the best visuals. The best games of 2023. To start things off, I have the best multiplayer party game. What game embodies multiplayer goodness? This can be more party-oriented with a focus on local multiplayer, or it can be more specific to online play. The first game that came to my mind was Super Mario Bros. Wonder, and while Wonder is a wonderful game, it's really not that fun in a multiplayer setting. No longer jumping on your friends is an improvement over the co-op in the new Super Mario Bros. Series, but still having the camera locked into just a single player is still just as frustrating as ever. Now, Party Animals was the second game that came to mind with its emphasis on cute and hilarious chaos. Waddling around as a bunch of goofy animals is so fun you can't ever really be that upset if a round doesn't go your way because its playing is just fun. With that said, my favorite multiplayer party game this year is Street Fighter 6. Street Fighter 6 is a blast online or in person. From what limited experience I did have playing online, the connection was super smooth and responsive. I never once felt like my connection screwed me up on my impressive 1-9 streak. My only real complaint is the lack of a cooperative team mode, but going head to head is still exhilarating. Mortal Kombat 1 is also a ton of fun, with even more characters, but Street Fighter 6 controls feel a tad bit crispier, and the new accessibility settings are awesome for varying skill levels. Personally, even though I suck at fighting games, I stuck with the classic controls to give myself the most attack options possible when playing with my niece and nephew. The new control schemes made playing with them a lot more competitive than it maybe would have been. It's hard to beat a good old-fashioned fighting game for 1v1 action, and fighting games don't really get any better than Street Fighter 6. Generally, I like to look back on the year that was, highlighting the positive, but like any other year, this one has had a few disappointments. As I say every year, I don't go out of my way to play games that look bad or uninteresting, and so the biggest disappointment of 2023 isn't the worst game of the year, but rather the one that let me down the most. So sorry to disappoint, but no Lord of the Ring, Gollum, or King Kong here. Everything goes back to expectations, and while I try to go into most games with a neutral state of mind, I definitely am not void of expectations. The first game that comes to mind as a disappointment for me is Resident Evil 4. With all the praise surrounding it and having never played through the original, I was super excited to experience the greatness. While I loved the premise, atmosphere, and visuals, I just couldn't connect with the gameplay. But I think this is more of a me thing than the game itself. I've come to the conclusion and have learned about myself, I just don't really like survival horror games. This was also reinforced by a similar experience I had with Dead Space earlier this year. For many, Starfield could easily take this category. My feelings are a bit more complicated. In certain ways, Starfield did disappoint me with the lack of satisfying exploration, certain elements of the presentation and the UI. But on the flip side, combat, shipbuilding, certain locations, and quests exceeded my expectations. So it's hard to say that it's my biggest disappointment. Final Fantasy XVI is another interesting one in that ultimately I would say I enjoyed my time with the game, but based on my excitement after playing the demo, the rest of the game fell short of my expectations. I wasn't expecting the demo to give me such an accurate slice of what the entire game was going to play like. So what I mean is the game never really opens up on an RPG or exploration level while maintaining its super cutscene focused linear approach. But being honest with myself, by far my biggest disappointment of the year was EA UFC 5. And maybe I shouldn't have been with EA being in the title. With a 3-year gap between the last entry, I was really hoping the developers were going to take the time to make meaningful improvements to the game as a whole. And while the new in-game engine and the revamp of cuts is interesting, I can't help but feel this title drops the ball in almost every way that matters. Just to list a few things, the game still doesn't have a dynamic TKO system. Creative Fighter is basically the same with no way to individualize your character. Movement still feels janky at times, and those are just a few obvious ones. All of these low-hanging fruit were ignored while aspects that didn't need to be changed were, and not necessarily for the better, like the remapping of uppercuts, hooks, and overhands, while spinning attacks have become overcomplicated and the submission system oversimplified. I could go on for an hour, but I'm just going to leave it at that EA UFC 5 was my biggest disappointment this year. Okay, with that out of my system, appropriately, we also have the pleasant surprise of the year. Bramble the Mountain King was an experience I went into blind, left amazed by. Such a creative and beautiful game that plays on your expectations and emotions so well. The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom pleasantly surprised me because I liked Breath of the Wild, but I didn't love it. So I was surprised to see Tears of the Kingdom's improvements really elevated my experience way more than I thought it would have. Fi Rush came out of nowhere and left me shocked by how good it was. Hogwarts Legacy's trailers and marketing material looked a little too good to be true. Looking at these 4 standouts, personally I'd have to give my nod to Fi Rush. This game is the definition of a pleasant surprise in so many ways. It was shadow dropped on the day of its announcement. From the outside it doesn't look like a game for me, but I ended up loving it, and you'd never guess the studio responsible for the Evil Within series would be attached to this project. Fi Rush has no business being as good as it is.
This'll be easy.
A new category I've added for this year is the Standout game mechanic. I was inspired to include this category by Dead Island 2's gore system. So Dead Island 2 isn't really all that great at any one thing, except its score system really does impress as its standout mechanic. Being able to cut through multiple layers of flesh really adds a ton to the hacking and slashing experience. The addition of Web Wings in Marvel Spider-Man 2 was another standout that took traversal to the next level in an already amazing traversal system. The Wonder Seed in Super Mario Bros. Wonder was another great mechanic to spice up the traditional Mario formula. But I think my favorite game mechanic this year was the Ultra Hand from The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. All the new abilities in Tears of the Kingdom are awesome, from Ascend to Recall and Fuse, but Ultra Hand is the main standout here. Being able to move around and combine objects had me feeling like anything was possible when dealing with a puzzle or traversal. Few games have given me the same sense of freedom and belief in my own creativity when pragmatically approaching a situation. Like climbing and gliding from Breath of the Wild, I hope more studios are inspired by these new game mechanics shown off in Tears of the Kingdom. How does a title look and how does it play? These questions are always asked when dissecting a game. However, also important and sometimes overlooked is the setting and world building. Being Spider-Man doesn't quite work without New York, Or how can you truly invest yourself in Final Fantasy XVI without a believable world worth fighting for? What was the best game world of 2023? When I say game world, I'm not specifically referring to an open world, but many of the best open worlds excel in building a believable and interesting place. Starfield did a great job of pulling off a near but distant future that feels high-tech yet vintage. NASA Punk is an accurate description I've heard thrown around. Yet I feel the disjointed nature of its world structure hurts it from feeling as massive or cohesive as it should be. Bramble the Mountain King really pulled me into its grim storybook universe, even though it's relatively small. Marvel Spider-Man 2 and Tears of the Kingdom did a great job of expanding their self-contained worlds while giving each location a sense of time passing. My pick is Hogwarts Legacy, specifically Hogwarts Castle. With a few exceptions, the world beyond Hogwarts Castle is just okay with a mediocre set of activities that comes across as superficial. However, with the castle grounds being so spectacular, it almost doesn't matter. Hogwarts perfectly nails the vibes of an old Scottish castle filled with magic and mysteries. Of course, there's the source material the game draws upon, but actually pulling it off is still super challenging. Personal feelings aside, the concept and many details of the castle were created by J.K. Rowling, but from there, the location scouts, set designers, and editors had to bring their interpretations of the location to life in the films. And now you have the developers at Avalanche, who had the task of blending elements from the movies and the books, while filling in much of the blank in between on their own. The final product is an achievement of hard work, talent, and passion. Hogwarts Castle is definitely the in-game location that impressed me the most this year. The next category is the best narrative. It's funny because time can often affect the way you feel about a game, movie, TV show. When it comes to games in particular, I feel my initial impressions of gameplay tend to vary much less over time compared to the narrative itself. I really liked Marvel Spider-Man 2's story, but having only played through it once, I'm curious to see how I'll feel about it after my second, third, or fourth time. Mortal Kombat 1 was pleasantly entertaining, like that of a cheesy action film with a likable cast of characters. Not my favorite narrative this year, but I enjoyed it quite a bit. Fi Rush has mostly been praised for its presentation and gameplay, but I think it also has an excellent story as well. Fi Rush captures the essence of an after-school kids show that was also made to be enjoyed by adults, with some powerful universal messages. Final Fantasy XVI was a title that somewhat let me down in the gameplay department while excelling in the story side of things. The plot gets a little out there during the second half of the game, and while I still enjoyed it, I definitely enjoyed the more gray political aspects of the first half more, even if I struggled to follow it. FF16 has a strong ending, but overall I relate to and enjoyed Marvel Spider-Man 2's narrative the most this year. I have my own personal nitpicks about the story, but I've also noticed other elements of the plot are even more well thought out than I had initially thought. The depiction of characters and their relationships really sealed the deal for me. I can empathize with the heroes and the villains' motivations, which makes the series of events land as well as they do. I feel Insomniac did a great job of telling a beloved known Spider-Man story while putting their own spin on it. Again, I'm interested to see how it will feel after my second playthrough, probably at the beginning of next year, but I'm confident Marvel Spider-Man 2 had my favorite narrative this year.
I have no idea.
What game this year had the best visuals? This category is always hard because it comes down to what do you value most? Style or fidelity, and how do those two overlap? The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is held back by the hardware limitations of the Switch, but is able to output an impressive image all things considered. Not on Switch, Fi Rush takes elements of the cel-shaded look mentioned in Tears of the Kingdom to their natural conclusion. Fi Rush has so much attention to detail in the near and far, there's always something interesting to look at. You could say the mise-en-scène is always eye-catching. Final Fantasy XVI also showed off a lot of great framing with some spectacular sights. Resident Evil 4 nailed its tone while bringing the very lifelike look to reality. As per usual, Forza Motorsport also killed it at photorealism. There was no stone left unturned when bringing each of these cars to life. Marvel Spider-Man 2 has a great look, but is arguably more impressive in a technological sense. Few games to date have shown the ability to load in so much detail so quickly. With all the great games I've played to completion, it's kind of funny because I'm giving this category to Resident Evil 4. One of my big revelations this year is I just don't connect with survival horror, but I will say I could not stop looking at Leon's hair. I was starting to wonder what kind of brand of conditioner is this man using on his beautiful head of hair. It's probably why I kept dying, but beyond hair, the rest of the game's look and feel works perfectly. To be honest, this is such a pick'em category, but the game that kept sticking out in my head was definitely Resident Evil 4. Best music is another tough category with an abundance of awesome scores and soundtracks. Maybe I'm just easy to please, but I feel most modern video games have at least good music. To kill the suspense, my favorite soundtrack is Final Fantasy XVI. As I've mentioned already, not my favorite title to come out this year, but the music kills it at getting me pumped up to go into battle. The blend of angelic vocals, a symphony of stringed instruments, complemented by the powerful beating drums, just blends together so well. Even many of the lower energy tracks were still fantastic at giving me a feeling of introspection and reflection between many of the bombastic battles. Final Fantasy XVI had my favorite music this year, but I had several close runner-ups. In theory, this should have been a lock for Fi Rush, with the game centering around feeling the beat. And while it fell short of being my favorite, I did love its blend of music and gameplay. Marvel Spider-Man 2 can easily be summarized as more of the same in the music department, and while that's somewhat true, many of the new tracks are excellent, like both Harry and Kraven's themes. Starfield's theme song is iconic, but surprisingly I like some of the later tracks even more. Last notable mention is Tears of the Kingdom, and similar to Spider-Man 2, much of the music from Breath of the Wild carried over, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. When I look at Tears of the Kingdom's mix of music and visuals, I can't help but compare it to something out of a Hayao Miyazaki movie. Great music from a year of great games. So what is my game of the year? Well, I don't really pick a singular game of the year, but probably the most important category to many when picking a game of the year is what was the most fun. I've been able to find the fun in many games I've played this year, and so it's all about separating the good from the great. What game or games had the highest of highs and the most often? On a fun scale of 1 to 10, what title averaged the highest? Both Hogwarts Legacy and Starfield had some high highs, but could also get pretty low at times. Overall, I had a blast with Tears of the Kingdom, but it also had several moments of frustration that took me out of the fun. Street Fighter 6 gave me some of the most fun I've had with a fighting game in a really long time, but like most fighting games, I did eventually stray away. Fi Rush is mostly non-stop action, which puts into perspective how satisfying and fun it can be, because it never got old. Up until October, Fi Rush would have easily been my pick here. Super Mario Bros. Wonder gave me a superb platforming experience that pulled on my nostalgia for the good old days of Mario 3 and World, while being just unique enough to stand on its own. It's hard to beat a great 2D Mario, but Marvel Spider-Man 2 surprisingly has. Believe it or not, as much as I enjoyed Marvel Spider-Man and Miles Morales, neither of those games would have been the game I had the most fun with in each of their respective years. Yet Spider-Man 2's made enough improvements to stand out in such a packed year. I always knew this would be an addition and refinement kind of sequel, yet I was surprised by just how much fun I was having. Combat was already great, but the addition of the parry, boss battles, and special moves really elevated my experience. The traversal system in 2018 Spider-Man had a solid case to be made as one of the best traversal systems ever made, but the refinement around swinging and the addition of the weblings left me with this feeling of perfection. Is Spider-Man 2 the best game ever made? No, but it's so good at being fun from the moment to moment. The open world in Spider-Man 2 isn't the most explorative, but I found myself addicted to its consistently rewarding gameplay loop. The mix of variety, combat, and traversal puts Marvel Spider-Man 2 as the game I had the most fun per minute playing. So those are the categories. On screen is a list of my top 10, loosely ranked by my enjoyment levels. Final Fantasy gave me some of my highest of highs this year while struggling to maintain that. Bramble the Mountain King's gameplay isn't revolutionary, but the atmosphere was top tier. Between Street Fighter 6 and Mortal Kombat 1, I have a slight preference towards the feeling of Street Fighter 6, but overall I enjoyed MK1 a little bit more because of the story mode. Hogwarts Legacy and Starfield are quite similar in a lot of ways. Both great games with fantastic world building, surprisingly fun combat, while also both falling short of amazing due to some poor design choices. In my opinion, these top 4 games are all masterpieces in one way or another, while having things I could easily nitpick, but overall super fun. What does your top 10 look like? You may or may not have voted, but this year I also constructed a tournament to decide my audience's game of the year. Originally I was going to make the tournament completely random, but I ended up with a bunch of crazy matchups off the bat, like Tears of the Kingdom versus Baldur's Gate 3 versus Alan Wake 2 in the very first round. So instead I randomly distributed the top 10 most popular and critically received games into separate matches for the first round, and then filled in the rest by somewhat of genre relevancy. After all those rounds, these are the top 6. For the most part, this list mirrors the Game Awards 6 nominees, which I find to be interesting. Much more interesting, unlike the Game Awards, in the top 6 we have RoboCop Rogue City. On one of the previous polls, I saw it losing to Hogwarts Legacy, and then the next day it just had randomly taken it over. From there, even though RoboCop was behind Mario Wonder on a previous poll, it somehow smashed it this time around. My brain can't seem to comprehend these results, so I'm not sure what's going on here. I don't know if someone has some bot accounts, if this poll is being recommended to a bunch of RoboCop fans, or if it's a glitch on the YouTube side of things, but nonetheless, coming in at a very, very dominant 5th place is RoboCop Rogue City. I might have to check it out after all of this. While not as logic-defining, I was also surprised to see Marvel Spider-Man 2 get first. Being a game I really clicked with, I just figured its sequelitis would get it booted somewhere around the semifinals. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised, considering at least a third of my subscribers come from one of my Spider-Man videos. I was surprised to see Street Fighter 6 and Alan Wake 2 not get very far. A few really big games like Street Fighter 6, Fi Rush, FF16, Starfield, Lies of P, and Diablo 4 are all lost in the very first round, so I'm curious to see how much the final results could have been shaken up if a few games were moved around just a little bit. Nonetheless, I had a ton of fun seeing how you guys voted. As awesome as 2023 was for new game releases, I wouldn't mind a few less games next year to give both the games, the players, and the developers more breathing room. What does your best of list look like? I'll be uploading a top 10 list of upcoming 2024 games, so keep a lookout for that. As always, I appreciate you for watching, and until next time, see ya.